Yeah. When do you think we as a society stopped agreeing on how to have a public discourse?
Well, I mean, it's been happening very, very gradually for quite some time, and I do think part of what we're seeing right now, we're clearly seeing this backlash against
Mhm.
what's being called wokeness,
It's become a dirty word.
and I teach a class called Carrot Sticks, Nudges and Norms, which is about persuasion. And the class is very much from the perspective of um, tactically what's actually effective and what's ineffective at trying to persuade other people. We engage in a lot of shaming in ways that can feel very good, but is tactically is not very productive from a persuasion standpoint. So, I mean, for a while, I just thought, wow, people are getting really clueless about persuasion, and but I think I've come to realize that it's part of the problem is that people are not really engaged in persuasion. And in the book that I co-wrote with Saul Perlmutter and John Campbell, we, toward the end of the book, we talk about the notion of arguing in good faith. And arguing in good faith for us is when all parties are actually open to the truth
Mm.
and willing to change their mind, and they're joined by a common search for the truth. So they're starting from very different positions. But if they're arguing in good faith, they at least want to reach agreement on empirical realities. And I don't think that's really what we're seeing in a lot of discourse right now. We're not seeing people trying to persuade other people. What we're really seeing is people trying to sort of bully people and coerce people. I am
I
arguing
love
that
that.
for quite some time I've seen this move away from actually trying to persuade people through actual you know ideas and arguments, and we need to get that back.
Robert MacCoun is a Stanford law professor, a social psychologist, and the co author of Third Millennium Thinking Creating Sense in a World of Nonsense. Based on a wildly popular UC Berkeley course, the book explores how to use scientists' tricks of the trade to make the best decisions and solve the hardest problems in an age of uncertainty and overwhelming information. In this book, a physicist, a psychologist, and a philosopher introduce readers to the tools and frameworks that scientists have developed to keep from fooling themselves. On today's podcast, we talk with Rob about when society stopped agreeing on how to have a healthy public discourse and how to build trust among seeming adversaries to start to reignite those healthy conversations. We dig into confirmation bias, scientific optimism, and the importance of healthy skepticism. We talk about research, public policy, and how we keep eroding our own credibility with almost every single statement that we make. The goal of today's conversation is to find ways to get better at staying open minded. Because unless we can find a way back to the practice of disagreeing without losing sight of the goal of finding common ground, we might just all be doomed. I want to take a step back because for anyone who hasn't read the book, the context is powerful. And the genesis of the book was this course at UC Berkeley. My understanding is there was this fear that people, students, everyone on the planet had lost their ability to have truly open discourse in good faith, as you put it. And the theory behind it was to apply research training. So it makes sense that they would bring you in with a background in social psychology and in law because there is a model, a framework to how you convince people, how you make your point, what is considered a valid argument in the law, as there is in science.
Being a psychologist by training, when I had a voicemail message from a Nobel laureate in physics, I was quite baffled. Could not imagine why he wanted to meet with me. Saul, to his credit, he he saw the strengths of the natural sciences coming from physics, but he sought out a philosopher. And the next on the list, I think I was next on the list was the psychologist. Um, I suppose we could have added a poet and a proctologist and anybody else with a P. We were kind of working our way through the P's, but so this is
That
very
would be a
interdisciplinary.
longer opening to the joke, because then it would
Yeah,
be a
that's right.
physicist, a
That's right.
laureate, an
Yeah, we all
attorney,
walk into a
a
bar.
social psychologist, and a proctologist walk into a bar. That's a lot less interesting as a hook.
We started with what's actually kind of abstract question. A democratic society where it's one person, one vote, why should a scientist speaking out on an issue get any more weight than anyone else?
Mm-hmm.
And in many respects, they shouldn't. And so that got us really focusing on we were talking about the role of science in a democracy, but as we were having conversations among ourselves, one of the things we noticed was that working scientists routinely disagree with each other, and yet they do so in a way that rarely leads to bloodshed, and is mostly pretty constructive and civil. And this, despite all the most extreme things we see happen in the law is also a profession where professionals get together and disagree for a living. And so we're struck by the fact that there are communities who routinely argue with people who disagree with them, and yet somehow manage to move the ball forward.
And maintain mutual respect.
Yeah, mutual respect is certainly part of it. But we also, in particular, in talking about scientists, we realize that in the social sciences and the natural sciences, there are certain what we call habits of mind that are inculcated in the training process, ways of learning to spot bad arguments, and to catch yourself in motivated cognition or wishful thinking, and not everybody is trained in those, and they're not in the science textbooks. They're part of the culture.
Oh, and your book is very academic, granted, right? Not everybody's going to pick up this book because of that. But what I like about it is the bent towards the practical. You make a really good case for how scientists go at their discovery, deliberately attempting to seek out and demonstrate that they have rooted out any potential for their own bias in their conclusion. Attorneys start their argument knowing that they have a planned endpoint. So it's clear for everyone to see that there's an agenda all around. So there's this belief right now that we're so polarized and it's never been like this. And I don't think that's true, because I think 1,000 years ago, we all lived in one village. We lived in one village. There was one village elder. The village elder was a priest or a mullah or a Swami or whatever it was, and they were the be-all and end-all on moral matters. You couldn't argue it because there was nowhere else to look, right? Then I think at some point, science and true scientific pursuits came to the forefront, and it was a period of time where I think almost those academic and scientific pursuits were considered elevated but apart from society and public discourse. Somehow the idea of an expert from that elevated academic tower infiltrated its way into society. I think somewhere along the way what happens is people start to reject religion because it no longer serves their lives as the world gets larger and more interconnected and people start to mingle. That's probably healthy. But as a result, they decide to start to reject everything and say, you're not the arbiter of the truth. And what they forgot was they already had a set of baked in notions, intentions, values, fears, whatever it is, that were driving them to reject the scientific experts. I think you're probably the linchpin that brings it into the real world, because you were working on politically charged issues. What lens do you think you brought to third millennium thinking? And what were some of the social issues that perhaps you'd worked on at Rand that helped you elevate or deepen the conversation?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me about that. I'm identified on the book jacket as a psychologist, and that is a big part of the disciplinary perspective I bring to the table. But I do think you are correct that whether or not I'm the linchpin, I don't know, but you're correct that part of the perspective I brought was not as a psychologist, but as a public policy analyst, someone who had, so I spent 7 years at the Rand Corporation as a public policy analyst, and then I taught for over 20 years at the Goldman School of Public Policy at Berkeley, and I was a visiting professor in public policy at Princeton. And I was very involved in two highly contentious issues. One is the drug legalization debate and the related debate about needle exchange and harm reduction, and basically all the debates around recreational or psychoactive drugs, but also working in Washington on the question of allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly in the U.S. military. And in both cases, my professional role and my personal aspiration was to be an honest broker. Not to be an advocate and try to push my personal views on anyone, but to really try to help to clarify the empirical dimension of these questions. What do we know about what would happen if you legalize drugs, the actual consequences? What do we know? What would happen to military unit effectiveness if gays and lesbians were allowed to serve openly?
And I love that question. It's very clear you're going to military effectiveness. You are taking any kind of value judgment out of the question. And I didn't.
What I can say is, so one of the key questions that the Clinton administration asked when they were trying to decide whether to lift the ban was, will units basically fall apart if someone comes out of the closet? So that's an empirical question. And we couldn't go out and in neither of these topics could I go out and run controlled experiments.
Yeah. So what was the result of that one? How is military effectiveness altered by allowing gay members in the military?
So we pulled together all the evidence we can find from. I read every academic study, but also every unpublished military study about something called unit cohesion or group cohesion, because opponents of allowing gays and lesbians to serve kept saying that unit cohesion, this thing called unit cohesion, would collapse. So I looked at all the evidence on that. We looked at police and fire departments, which are sort of paramilitary organizations that had non-discrimination policies, to see what happened. Mm-hmm. We looked at the racial desegregation in the U.S. military, and we looked at foreign militaries that had lifted ban on gay and lesbian service. Mm-hmm. And every line of evidence we looked at unanimously said, this is not a big deal. This is not going to lead to any noticeable effect on military effectiveness. And we very confidently asserted that that's what the evidence said during the Clinton administration. They ignored us and came up with don't ask, don't tell. But drug legalization is quite different, because drug legalization, there really are trade-offs on all the different lines of evidence pointing in different directions. So it's been much messier.
So you applied that lens in a couple of examples. I'm sure they were not the only ones, right? While you're working at Rand Corporation, you did a lot of public policy work. What did you learn about how politics collides with evidence and how that can teach us to better alter public discourse?
Well, the first thing that was really apparent in both experiences, and this is part of the loss of trust that people have, is that I saw a lot of experts um, putting their thumb on the scale on one way or the other, uh, cherry picking evidence to just present the evidence that favored a position they wanted to favor. But they're basically saying, like in the movie Ghostbusters, Bill Murray's character says, "Back off, man! I'm a scientist." Like step back. You have to listen to me. I have this authority, and that's what the experts were doing. So
Ah.
so for example, some of the military experts on unit cohesion
Mm.
gave testimony that was directly contradicted by their written documents. And because I was like the only person in the country who had actually read all this stuff, I had it right in front of me as they were talking. I said, "That's wait, you just defined for the U.S. Senate unit cohesion, and you changed your own definition. You added words
Yeah.
because the definition you had written down didn't exclude gays, and so now and there were the case after case of this, and
Well,
this
that's
certainly.
infuriating for you.
Oh, it's infuriating. Well, everybody should be infuriated by that. And in the book, we are not. I want to make clear for people who haven't read the book, this is not shut up and listen to the scientist book. Our book is quite tough on scientists. We have an entire chapter about expert overconfidence with lots of examples. And then we have another entire chapter on scientific pathology.
Mm.
And we talk about all the ways in which scientists sometimes abuse the authority that's been given to them.
Right.
And if you abuse it, it's not surprising there's going to be this backlash. And so,
Right.
my own social psychology right now is, we've been sent out to the dog shed because of the replicability crisis. We took a big hit to our credibility, but we deserve to. I mean, we need to earn it back. If you look at what was happening in publication practices, people were abusing their authority, and we deserve to take a hit to credibility. So now we have to earn it back.
But the use a couple of terms in the book that I think people should understand. And they're all intertwined. So there's scientific optimism versus learned helplessness. There's fashionable cynicism, and then I want to put in humility, right?
Mm-hmm.
What can we learn from these phrases to make ourselves better at staying open?
Yeah, let me start with humility because I think this is so important. So in the book, we devote a lot of attention to what we call probabilistic thinking as kind of a superpower for improving your own quality of thinking, but also improving your own credibility.
Mm-hmm.
And but probabilistic thinking really, if we just say I want to be a humble person, it's hard to just decide to adopt a personality trait, right? But probabilistic thinking cultivates humility, and also it gives us permission to be humble because there's no loss of face. If I say to you, and if you roll back the recording here, I probably overstated how absolutely unequivocal the case was that gays and lesbians wouldn't. Now my confidence level is pretty high on that, partly because I have the benefit of 15 years of hindsight. But at the same time, there's a big difference between saying there will be no damage to military effectiveness and saying, look, based on the best available evidence, we believe that there's a very low probability that any unit will have a breakdown in effectiveness. It's not disastrous to my ego if there turns out to be one example that proves me wrong. Okay.
Exactly.
But I'm also being honest with you by saying, we don't know things with certainty. And so I think that probabilistic thinking and intellectual humility work together to build trust and credibility.
Right. And I think in certain parts of business, I spent my life in finance and private equity. You are rewarded for being certain. Science as a discipline has that focus of healthy skepticism. What is confirmation bias and how can we avoid it in our daily lives?
Yeah, so confirmation bias is such a pervasive problem because our brains seem to be hardwired. Um, if we're trying to test a proposition that all all Scorpios are hostile, in astrology, um, and you ask someone, well, how would you try to prove that? There, there's this compelling tendency to start looking for examples of hostile people born under the sign of Scorpio. And so
Right.
they start finding examples of hostile behavior by Scorpio people. And they say, look at all this evidence. But of course, if you step back and you realize, well, first of all, there are 11 other zodiac signs, and surely they all act hostile sometimes too. So what about the non-Scorpios that are hostile? There are lots of Scorpios who do non-hostile things all the time. So what about all the non-hostile behavior by Scorpio? And then, of course, you've got the non-hostile behavior by non-Scorpio. So you have four. That's a 2 by 2 table of are you Scorpio or not? Are you hostile or not? And we're drawn to that one cell, the hostile Scorpio cell. And our brain just seems to work that way. And I think our brain probably evolved that way because it's a quick and dirty way to see if there's at least rough support for your evidence. So confirmation bias is not totally crazy, but if you don't look for the contrary evidence, you, you and you avoid it, you never challenge your views, and you don't improve your views. So
Is confirmation bias a result more of our fear or laziness?
well, I would say laziness more than fear. I mean, it's overdetermined, and fear is clearly an element too. So in the book, and uh, we use a distinction that's common in psychology between hot biases and cold biases.
Mhm.
Um, Hot biases are emotion and motivation and desire. Cold biases are just the way our brain processes information. And I think for confirmation bias, there are clearly hot elements to it. But even if you give people problems that they have no personal stake in whatsoever, they will still engage in confirmation bias. So I think fundamentally, and that's what I'm going to categorize that as laziness
Mhm.
because it's literally um, energy saving. It's your brain um, can make decisions with very little metabolic work. Your brain is consuming glucose all the time. Your brain actually uses a lot of energy, and your brain is constantly looking for ways to cut corners. And confirmation bias is a good way to do that.
How much of our confirmation bias is done consciously versus subconsciously?
I think it's 90% unconscious.
Mm.
We're aware of so little of what's going on in our brain.
But we have to
Um,
train ourselves out of it. You talk about these conversation prompts. I love that because I'm looking at how to use your concept of third millennium thinking to positive effect in my own life.
it's possible to cultivate certain conversational prompts, certain patterns of interaction with other people in which we can gently tease each other and point out to each other when one of us is really veering off course and saying things that are just not very plausible. And and to some level, we try to teach our children this too. Use your inside voice is is an important habit of community, right? Use your inside voice.
Oh, I just made a mental connection. It's almost like you're saying, because my children are young enough that I use the phrase inside voice. It's almost like you're saying that um probabilistic thinking and percentage-based conversation prompts are the adult version of the childhood inside voice.
I love that. I
Did we
love that.
just make a connection? All right,
I,
great.
I,
Stay tuned for our parenting book. Okay.
I, yeah, we sort of backed into that, but that really is a wonderful way of describing probabilistic thinking.
Yeah,
So
use my inside voice. All right, next time I'm mad at someone, I'm going to use my probabilistic inside voice. and see if it lands better. Love the way you describe the concept of dynamic stability. I grew up skiing, so it resonated.
So the challenge is, and it is a challenge, I'm not saying it is easy, is just to cultivate this mix of skepticism about factual claims that I'm always wary that I could be wrong about factual claims.
Mm-hmm.
Combine that with optimism that there is a solution out there. And although we may not know what it is yet, if we apply our skepticism, but we keep trying, we are going to make progress. And it's so we have this notion of in the book of skiers going downhill, constantly adjusting their weight, and it's a dynamic process. You never. I mean, I think we all have this sort of childlike desire to solve problems once and for all. Like, if only I could get my PhD, then suddenly life will be fine and I'll be set for life.
Yeah,
Or if only I could get this job that I always wanted, or if I make partner, or if I get tenure, or if she says yes, that she'll marry me, or then finally I'll be set for life. And in life, we just continually find that no, it never ends.
Never ends.
It never ends. And the sooner you kind of realize that no, the problem solving never ends, the sooner you start getting nimble and being willing to not get locked into a position, but shift your weight and adjust and that we and so COVID is such a polarizing topic, but let's go back and look at the scientific response to COVID. Mistakes were made, but they started from a position of real ignorance. And I think just unequivocally, the evidence shows that vaccines have saved enormous numbers of lives. They developed those vaccines in remarkably quick
record time compared to the history of humanity and what's been done before.
They made mistakes along the way. They also made mistakes in some of the advice they gave us. There were definitely mistakes made, but it was an actually very nimble process. When you think about what a short time period we're really talking about in human history, we're talking about really a period of 18-24 months. The remarkable technical progress we made was made possible through scientific optimism, because they believed we will find a vaccine, and skepticism, because they rejected a lot of ideas along the way. Did they do it perfectly? Absolutely not. If you could play back the clock and do it over again, there are things that I wish public officials would have said differently. There's certainly things I wish that the president at the time would have not said that were unhelpful in terms of introducing solutions that
drinking
really
bleach, for example.
Yeah. So there are a lot of things to regret about the way things were conducted, but mostly I think it's a pretty remarkable success story of how quickly we responded to a crisis.
On that topic of COVID, without getting political, because neither one of us is trying to have that conversation, what did we learn from COVID? Or I should say, what do you predict and or hope for the next time? Because we know that it's coming.
Yeah, it is coming. And
what do you predict or hope for the next time?
Well, I mean, one of the first things we clearly have to do politically is we can't pin all the blame on whoever just happens to be president. Anyone who would have been president at that time was dealt a very bad hand as a politician, right? And so to the extent that people on the right thought that the left was trying to use science as a club to beat up on the president, which, let's face it, a lot of people on the left were doing, that was unhelpful because it created this backlash. Badging is when you take a position not because you think it's factually correct, but because it's a statement of identity. My
And
team is
feeling
on the
an
side.
attack by proxy.
Yeah, so I'm gonna double down on that side. So one of the first things we need to do next time is everybody needs to resist the temptation to to politicize um, the response, and that's very easy to say. It's
It's
hard to
easy
do.
to say.
But,
So much of this podcast, by the way, is about how we give ourselves grace. But a lot of it in these conversations has turned into how do we give others grace? Because we don't want to have the arguments, we don't want to have the friction, we don't want to have the stress in the balance of our lives. I think the best way we can do that across any topic is to think to yourself along the lines of something you mentioned in the book. Is this person's vehemence on this topic coming from fear, values, or something else?
each side perceives that the other side wants to totally destroy um, their opponent,
Oh.
and so both sides see this as this, uh, and if it's really all or nothing, winner take all, then everybody suddenly becomes willing to fight really dirty
Hmm.
because the alternative is to lose everything. Compromises are seen as morally weak and feckless and cowardly and bland. And right now, people do not like compromise. But that really is how we managed to thrive as for the first 2 centuries of this country was a lot of really famous compromises
Hmm.
getting made along the way.
Third millennium thinking goes into so much of the science and the evidence and the frameworks for how we can um, train ourselves to be more curious and open to public discourse. Are we losing the promise of free speech?
Well, I think it's very easy to equate free speech and open discourse as if those are the two are the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't perceive much lack of free speech in American society right now. I think I think everybody's engaging in a pretty emphatic voicing of their free speech. I mean, to the point where I think things are getting said out loud
It
that,
shouldn't.
well, at least I won't say that shouldn't, but that would not have been said out loud 10 years ago.
But I said,
So,
but then I mischaracterized the question because I think of the promise as free. The promise of free speech to me was the promise of the potential to be heard and included in a public discourse. It
yeah,
was not for me the promise of a bullhorn. I don't
yeah,
think that's what the forefathers meant. I've never asked them, but
yeah. No, that's an important distinction you just made there. And so I think we have everyone has lots of opportunities to um, to voice their points of view right now. That's despite all the hand wringing and claims to the contrary, there are lots of outlets for people to engage in free speech. So right now we all have lots of opportunities to talk, but that's very different from saying we all have lots of opportunities to be heard and to
and
make a
I'm
difference.
equating them. I'm equating
Yeah.
free speech with public discourse and dialogue. So then, in a nutshell, in the context of all of this, what is third millennium thinking?
Well, the um, the title "Third Millennium Thinking" can sound a little grandiose, but in the book we really argue that science itself is constantly evolving, um, and that these habits of mind and habits of community that we're continuously improving our tricks of the trade for doing better, and so it's not a static thing; it's a work in progress. Um, but all the different things that we think fall under the umbrella of third millennium thinking are different techniques to allow people um, to arrive at a shared understanding of the truth in order to solve real public problems that need to be solved, not just abstract intellectual questions about the nature of reality. And by the way, you know, in the book we're very pro science, but I mean, I think all three of us think that reality is far weirder than humans can possibly fathom. I mean, there's nothing bland about scientific reality. It is deeply, deeply weird in ways that we don't understand. Um, Everything we're learning in the sciences is just we live in an astonishingly weird universe. So this is not a sort of bland view of reality,
Weird
but
and boring. Yeah.
but but you need some basic shared understanding um, of certain problems that are confronting us in order to figure out how to proceed and what are the possible errors we could make. And um, our book, which we really want a more inclusive kind of dialogue where people really do have more voice. We think we think scientists need to listen more to the general public and to take far more seriously the responsibility that comes with the enormous technological power of science. And and so what we're trying in the book is to share some of these tools that are out there so that they're available for everyone on the right, on the left, of all ages, to participate more in public problem solving and to do so in a productive way. And the all ages thing is important because I think, to come full circle to something you said early in the conversation, um, this course attracted a lot of enthusiasm from young people at Berkeley. And I think it's because younger people feel a real hunger for there's got to be something better than the state of discourse and
They're
the way
looking for
it's
something
behaving.
more. They're looking
Yeah,
for a better way.
they look at the adults in their life and they see people behaving like
Toddlers?
so like toddlers, and our book is certainly who that's the audience I want to reach are
Mhm.
younger people who haven't gotten locked in yet into I'm going to defend my side at all costs. People who are still um, who are not locked into this rigid stance and who want the tools to be nimble, to be a nimble skier and adjust to the changing conditions.
So then I'll put it this way, for the greater good, given that we both know there's probably another pandemic coming and there will always be topics on which we fail to agree, if you could speak to America like it was a toddler, how can we calibrate our overconfidence?
Well, yeah, it's so. I mean that you said the book was a very academic book. My heart sank a little when you did that because this was our attempt to not be an academic book, but we are academics, and so we tried to make it as
Both.
accessible as possible. But this really the book really was our attempt not to speak to other scientists, but to speak to ordinary people, no matter what kind of education, and to say, look, here are all these ideas. You don't have to be a scientist with a laboratory to use these ideas. These ways of thinking can be cultivated by everyone. Um, um, so we do feel kind of evangelical about the ideas in the book that we want to give them. We want to share them. We want other people to know about them. You know, cultures are these big powerful moving trains, and it's very hard to steer the moving train and suddenly make it change direction. And so I don't think we're naive about the impact a book like this can have, but we wanted to do our part to offer some of these ideas.
I think people can all agree that their heels are hurting. We've been digging in our heels so much. And even if we thought we weren't, um, ultimately our heels are hurting from being dug in so hard. We want a way to let go. We want to reopen the conversation. And if nothing else, maybe what people get out of the concept of third millennium thinking is that a conversational prompt with just the little smallest piece of humility to say, I'm 80% confident about what I'm about to say, might change the way things go.
It opens up a little breathing room. The other person in the conversation relaxes a little bit every time they hear you do that. They relax a
Yeah,
little bit.
and
Um,
that's the goal.
because by saying I'm 80% confident, I'm allowing for the possibility that I might be wrong, you might be right.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so you relax when you hear me do that. And when you relax, then you say something that's a little less rigid, and then I relax, and then we both start to relax. And I was very influenced in my youth by studying Chinese martial arts, Tai Chi Chuan and Bagua Zhang, and some of these martial arts, which were constantly they were trying to teach us to relax, and all your instincts in a fight are to tighten up. But what they try to teach you is no, you'll be much more effective if you're relaxed. It's counterintuitive, but tensing your muscles makes you extremely vulnerable. Relaxing and flowing will make you more effective. And by the way, more effective doesn't necessarily mean you're going to hurt the other person more. It just means you're going to try to reduce the conflict in the situation, and maybe nobody will get hurt if both sides relax. A lot of fights don't need to be that.
And at the end of the day, we're all headed to the same destination. And that's what I love about doing this podcast, because my topics are so broad. Yet I have a woman who's a relationship expert whose podcast, Julie Manano, her podcast is my conversation with her was all about relationships. Her entire focus is on understanding that if you can create a system, an environment that's safe for your partner's nervous system, you have the best chance at a happy relationship. Someone else who I interviewed is wildly successful professionally, but has a very, very complicated life history and is also the world's most insect tattooed man. Uh, and he talks about being more peaceful in midlife because he describes himself as a calm pilot now. He understands the turbulence. And here we are talking about public policy, third millennium thinking, and the next, willing, not so horrible pandemic coming up. And we're talking about the same thing. Can we all just figure out how to calm down? Because we're all headed the same place.